And we are going to go back to Romans chapter 13 in our time together this morning. Romans chapter 13. There is a word in the New Testament that is commanded to all of us. And it is a word that we don't like. Sometimes. Other times we really like it because we know God commanded somebody else to do it toward us. And that's the word submission. Submission. Which, in just a vernacular sense, it means I admit somebody's bigger and more powerful than I am. Or has authority that I don't have. This is a concept that 2-year-olds especially struggle with. Have you noticed that? And 3-year-olds, and 4-year-olds, and 5-year-olds, and then it really blossoms at about 13 for a few years. As young people try to figure out where they fit into this world. And that's what the word submission is about. It is about understanding the authority structures of life so that we know how we fit. Now, most of you have grown up in an era where you probably didn't have chickens in your backyard or a barnyard full of chickens. My grandparents would have called this learning the pecking order. Have you ever heard of that? Yes. Learning the pecking order. Because what a flock of hens will do is they will figure out who's the boss and who's not. And they'll do it by pecking at each other. They just are nasty toward each other. Sometimes to the point of bleeding and killing. Until all the hens understand who's in charge. And then those that are not in charge are sometimes called henpecked. You've heard that. Henpecked. I don't know what the history is behind the village where I grew up, but I grew up in a village called Eatonville, Pennsylvania. And the nickname for the village was Henpeck. Like to be just an interesting, kind of wonder how that all came about. The pecking order. Who's in charge and who's not? Those are some of the most important lessons that a young person can learn. Because if they don't learn those lessons as a young person, guess what? They're in for a heap of struggle later on. Submission. We all would rather be in charge. We all would rather be in charge. But remember, James warns people that in the church that aspire to be teachers, they aspire to put themselves in some position of teaching authority. He says, watch out, because you're bringing upon yourself responsibility and accountability. So we all think we want to be in charge until we figure out the fact that if I'm in charge, there's actually somebody else who's in charge of me being in charge. And there's somebody else who's in charge of him being in charge, of me being in charge. And you're not the top dog. There's only one who's on the top of the peak. That's God himself. And everything else in creation has to submit to something or someone. It's working out all of those relationships in the church and in the home and in government to where we exercise that submission and obedience to God. Most of you are aware of the fact that God has established 3 institutions in history. On the first day, he created man, that which was day 6 of creation. He created Adam and Eve. He created family. That was the first institution, the first human authority structure upon the earth. And he gave Adam and Eve dominion over the whole earth. So actually, he created government and family on the same day. He gave them dominion over the whole earth. They were in charge. How well did they do at that? They didn't last real long, did they? They surrendered the kingdom to God's opponent, Satan, who spoke to them through the serpent. Instead of submitting to God, they submitted to someone who was trying to overthrow God, and thus pitched in with God's enemy and became the enemies of God, and here we are in this mess. God later instituted other forms of human government throughout the Old Testament, and we're not going to take time to study that today, but I believe that God has instituted governments among men. The scriptures are very clear. In fact, I've given you some extra notes on the back of the bulletin this morning. I encourage you to read those sometime this week. We've gone over all of that before in other studies. God has established human governments upon the earth because if we didn't have human governments keeping law and order, we would kill each other. We would destroy ourselves. Society would destroy itself. There would be chaos. I mean, look at what happens in a city when the power goes out, or when there's a blackout, or something like that. It's instant chaos, because the sin nature is stirred up and awakened in greater measure when they know there's no law and order. We could find thousands of examples of that in history. So God has established governments for law and order. And then in the New Testament, God has established the church, the local church. Now, the local church does not have authority over the community or over the state. The local church has authority over those who have become part of that local church. And God has put leaders in the local church, pastors and deacons, and sometimes we add others, people who are serving the church and have authority of one kind or another in some form. But there's the authority of the local church, the body of the local church. If you're a believer and you go astray and you start living a life of sin, the local church has the authority to come alongside you and say, listen, brother, you got to stop. You're ruining the name of Christ in our community. And the church has certain authority over our lives. We surrender that to the church when we join the church. That's all part of submission. And everyone in life has to submit. Everyone has to submit. You have to submit to traffic laws. You probably, everybody in this room who's of driving age is carrying some kind of government permission form to drive. You submitted to the rules. You went down and you took a test and an eye test and you did so many hours of driving and you got your license. What were you doing? You were submitting to the state and acknowledging they have the right to regulate this. So what's the problem? The problem is our sinfulness. Our sinfulness. Why do children chafe at the rules their parents make? Why do wives sometimes get frustrated with the decisions their husbands make? Why do church members sometimes disagree with the decisions their leaders make? Why do citizens sometimes want to violate the rules that the leaders have made? Well, sometimes it's because of our sinfulness. Once in a while, it's because we see they've made some kind of a mistake and we need to go through an appeal process to ask them, please reconsider this. But let's face it, 99.99 times out of 10, when you have a problem with the government, it's inside of you. Why do they have a stupid 35 mile an hour speed limit? This speed limit here should be 45. I know you never say that, but I'm just sharing some of what I struggle with. What is the believer's correct response to the authorities of life? In every case, the correct response is submission. Ephesians 5, husbands and wives submitting to one another, wives submitting to husbands, children submitting to parents, servants in the household submitting to their masters, citizens submitting to the state. Paul says it here, Peter says it, Christ said it. Submission to the state. Does that mean the state is always right? No, not by a long shot. So let's go through some of this here and see what's in the text of Romans chapter 13. We start with verse 1. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. I think that's what I just said. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. God wants us to submit to government. And in the outflow of the book of Romans, the manifestation of our obedience in chapters 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16 is a demonstration of the salvation that God has accomplished earlier in the book. So when you submit to government, you are manifesting a Christ-like attitude. If you struggle with submission, by the way, look at Christ. Christ was King of kings, Lord of lords, eternal God, creator of heaven and earth, Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, Ephesians, and other places. And yet, throughout his life, he submitted to the Father's will. He talked about his Father's will over and over in the Gospel of John. He prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but thine be done. Jesus glorified the Father by submitting to him. The most glorifying thing you can do for God is to submit to the authorities which God has established. Now, this is true for husbands and wives. Husbands are to submit to God by leading their husbands and by leading their wives and loving their wives the way Christ loved the church. Wives are to submit to their husbands the same way Christ submitted to the Father. So whether you're a husband or a wife, your role is to manifest Christ in the home. We could go through that with government, we go through it with children, and so on. The source of government's authority is the Lord himself. The second part of verse 1. There is no authority except from God. God is the source of all human authority. So, let me put it this way, and then bring up a problem. God is the one who has put governments in place. So government leaders are in place ultimately because God put them there. Now that probably immediately brings to your mind some people that were pretty nasty in government. Men like Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, Mao Zedong, and I mean, we could go through history and find a lot of names of wretched, wicked people who were in charge. They were the leaders of their countries or their government. Is God saying that he condones all that they did? No. He is saying that in God's created order, he has put people in charge. He has given them authority to be in charge to accomplish his will upon the earth. Do you believe that I as a pastor will answer to God for how I pastor this church? The scriptures tell me that. Do you believe that you as a parent will answer to God for how you parent your children? Certainly you will. Every government official of history will answer to God for how they governed God's creation. Keep that in mind. Every governing official in history, at any level, will answer to God for how they governed in God's plan for history. Because they are God's representative. They have God's authority. And when God gives someone authority to do something, he doesn't mess around with people that rebel and disobey. I've given you some further notes on the back about examples of those who have been judged in history because of their disobedience in being leaders. So let me just state a couple of things here. I have a corollary truth under that second section in the outline in the bulletin. Because God is the source of all human authority, any evil done by rulers is an abuse of God-given authority. And I've given you some other scriptures and examples there. You think of leaders in history that were accountable to God. Pharaoh directly accountable to God through Moses and through the miraculous work of God in his life and in Pharaoh's life. You have Saul, who was addressed directly by the prophet Samuel because of his disobedience and failure as God's leader. He did not do what God told him to do, and the kingdom was taken away from him. Probably one of the greatest examples of all time is the king Nebuchadnezzar, one of the greatest kings of history. And his own personal understanding that he came to of realizing that he was accountable to God. He thought he was God. He demanded people to worship him. Read Daniel 2, 3, and 4. If you haven't read that recently, read that and look at the accountability of Nebuchadnezzar as a king. Well, Paul goes on here in the text of Romans 13 to describe the purpose of government. And this is just a general statement. It certainly is not the all-inclusive statement of everything government is supposed to do. Rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. When you're driving down the road and you're going the speed limit or under, the police don't bother you. And sometimes they're even gracious and let you go a little bit more than the speed limit without stopping you. But if you are recklessly endangering life, they're going to stop you because you're doing something evil. You're being reckless. And you're recklessly endangering other people. Verse 4, for it, the government, is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So the word minister, a steward, a servant, is the government. And they do not bear the sword in vain. What Paul is saying there is they have the authority of God to punish evildoers, even to the point of using a sword. Now, a sword is not a traffic ticket. What would you use a sword for? That's capital punishment. So even to the point of capital punishment, government is authorized to use that when God calls for it. When does he call for that? Thou shalt not murder. Intentional murder. If a man destroys a human life, assaults the image of God in man by murdering anyone of any age, including unborn children, then the government has the authority of God to bring punishment to bear to the point of capital punishment. Like I said, this is not a description of everything that government is to do, but Paul's focus here seems to be on keeping law and order. Keeping law and order. And I want to live in an orderly society. I want my neighbors to be law keepers. And sometimes it's good to know that the police are driving up down the street once in a while. I've talked to the Kirtland police here, and I think probably others have in the past, because this building, if there's no one living in the parsonage, You got a big parking lot out here in the back and a pavilion, and this would be a likely spot for someone to pull in here and bring a couple cases of beer and have a party or something like that. So we've asked the Kirtland police to go ahead and drive through our parking lot when they're making the rounds around town. Just come in and pull through. But we do have lights on out there. Light discourages that kind of activity. They're keeping a lid on the evil. And that's very good. And we should submit to God's authority in government to do that. Does that mean that the government never does anything wrong? Obviously not. And the Bible does give us a few cases of examples of exceptions when men were blessed by God because they did not go along with the evil commanded by government. Daniel is one of those examples in the Old Testament, and the book of Acts gives us the example of the apostles when they were commanded by authorities to stop preaching in the name of Jesus. They just kept doing it because the authority of God had given them to preach superseded the authority of government to command them not to. Government has no authority from God to dictate to the human conscience. The government has no authority to tell people what to think or believe. Keep that in mind, because in the last 100 years, there have been more people killed by government than in any other century in history. And most of those people were killed because they weren't thinking what the government told them to think. And we're right on the edge of that here in this country. The believer is to submit to government, but that does not mean that government has the right to dictate to the human conscience. I want to make a couple comments here because there are groups who have misconstrued the church's relationship with government. The Apostle Paul, in the first century Roman Empire, grew up in Syria, went to seminary in Jerusalem, was living in Jerusalem as a young man when he began to persecute the church. Now, the Roman policy in the Roman Empire was, let's say you folks over here are Greeks, and you have 85 of your Greek gods, and over here you folks are Israelites, and you're weird because you only have one God. Nobody else in the world had just one God. Only those Jews had one God. The Roman policy was, when we conquer you, you can keep your gods. You have to accept our gods too. And ultimately, you have to worship the emperor. That came later. But you can keep your gods, that's okay. But you can't start anything new. You can't invent any new religions. That was the Roman law. Well, they had a problem with the Jews because they didn't want to accept the Roman gods, and they finally just kind of reached a place where they said, all right, as long as you don't cause riots, we'll just let you, well, I don't know what you're doing over there, but you're doing weird stuff. Nobody wanted to be the ruler of Israel. That's why Herod was given it. He wanted it. Nobody else did. He's like, yeah, you go over there, Herod. Just the main thing is you keep them from causing trouble. They're just weird over there. They only have one God. But you can't start any new gods. You can't have any new religions. There can't be anything else new. When the church started, people generally thought that the church was just something else the Jews were doing. It started in Jerusalem. It started as mostly Jewish people. And for the first years, it was mostly Jewish people. It was mostly an Israel thing. Most of the churches were in that area around Israel. But as the years went on and Paul started to take the gospel to Turkey and Greece and other places, the Jews started persecuting the Christians. And finally, someone in Rome woke up and said, wait a minute. If the Jews are persecuting these people, they must not be Jews. And so that came under the Roman law of nothing new. And so then the Christians began to be persecuted not only by the Jews, but also by Rome. At the time that Paul wrote the Roman epistle, there was a guy who was the emperor of Rome. His name was Nero. Maybe you've heard of him. Many historians think that he caused the fire to start in Rome that burned half of the city of Rome down. And by the way, Rome at that time was built, a lot of the apartment houses in Rome were 5-story wooden structures. Wooden buildings 5 stories high, packed with hundreds of thousands of people. Now, how fast do you think a fire would spread in a closely packed city like that? Well, Nero blamed it on the Christians. And that gave him an excuse to persecute the Christians even more. And without going into all the graphic details, he did some horrendous things to the Jewish people. Horrendous things. To the Christian people. He's on the throne as Paul is writing this epistle, saying to the people in the city of Rome, submit to the king. Submit to the government. Oh, Paul. Now later, Paul himself is going to be there, perhaps under Nero's rule. He's going to be a prisoner, and he's going to go in and he's going to present the gospel to Nero, and he's going to end up with his head chopped off. He's not saying the government will always do the right thing. He's saying the church's position is to let the government govern as God's governing officials. The church has a job that's different. We need to do our job, let the government do their job. And don't rebel against the government. The government's eventually the government's going to find a reason to pick on you anyway. Don't give them a reason. That's not necessary. Part of the problem through history has been that after the 3rd or 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine decided that everybody in the Roman Empire should be a Christian. So you had primarily a pagan nation and a smattering of churches and Christians around the Roman Empire. And all of a sudden, overnight, everybody who's a Roman is officially a Christian, now by name. And this was the embryonic form of the Roman Catholic Church. So the government was in charge of the church. And the church and the government were one. Fast forward through history, you have all kinds of abuses of church authority because kings are in control of the church and the kings are in cahoots. The Reformation comes in the 1500s, and even though many of the reformers did some changing of things, many of the reformers, they might not have the Catholic Church. They have a different kind of church now, like the Lutherans in Germany, but they melded church and state together. They kept a state church. It's like the official church of Norway, I think, is still the Lutheran Church. That's the Church of Norway. If you're a preacher in the Lutheran Church in Norway, your paycheck comes from the government. You're a government employee, the government church. And the melding together of church and state has been a problem ever since the Roman Catholic Church started to do it 300 and 400 years after Christ. It is based on an assumption that the church of the New Testament is the same as Israel of the Old Testament. That God is done with Israel. He's not using Israel anymore. Now he's going to use the church. Remember that in Old Testament Israel, the spiritual kingdom and the political kingdom were the same. David, as the king, was a spiritual leader. He wasn't the only spiritual leader, But he was a spiritual leader. He was God's man. That is not true of the church. The church is separate from government. The church has no connection to civil authority. That equation of Israel equals the church throughout history said, well, then the church and the state are the same. If the Old Testament, Israel, government and religion were all the same, then that's the way it should be in the New Testament too. The church and government, the religion, it's all the same. And so in Calvin's area of Switzerland, in the city where his church was, it was illegal not to be a part of that church. And they passed laws about being in church a certain number of times a year and a week or whatever. And so all the government was regulating what you did in your church. Well, we all know how well government does with things. That would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Throughout history, however, there have been those that were never connected to the state government churches, individual groups of believers throughout history, ever since the time of Paul, who understood that the church and the government are two entirely different aspects of God's work in this world today, and that the government has never had authority in the New Testament era to tell people what to do spiritually. The government has no right to pass laws to tell you what church you should go to, or that you should go to church. Even in the early American colonies, this was a problem. The Reformation spilled over into North America. In New England, the Congregational churches, the Church of England connection, was they had laws in Massachusetts. You had to go to one of their approved churches. You had to be an approved preacher in Massachusetts to preach. You couldn't just go out and say, I'm studying the Bible and I'm learning and I'm going to preach. Roger Williams was banished from the New England colonies in the middle of the winter because he was preaching without government approval, without church approval, the government church. And they sent him to Rhode Island. If the Indians had not helped him survive the winter, he probably would have died. So what did he do? He founded a colony and said, in Rhode Island, you can believe whatever you want to believe. You can go to whatever church you want to go to. You can preach whatever you want to preach. In Virginia, it was the Church of England. And if you didn't have permission from the Church of England in Virginia and the Virginia governor on behalf of the Church of England and the King of England, you couldn't preach. And so a multitude of Baptist preachers and Bible-believing people were in jail in Virginia in the 16 and 1700s because they were preaching the Bible. They were preaching the gospel without church approval. They were starting independent Baptist churches and Bible churches all over the South, and they got in trouble, including scourging with whips, public floggings, arrests for preaching without government approval. Whenever you confuse church and state, Israel and the church, you're going to end up with problems. One of the outworkings of all of this is that in that area of where they connect everything with Israel is connected to the church. Well, in the Old Testament, you had circumcision. So in the New Testament, that must mean that we should be doing something with infants, so let's baptize them. So infant baptism was another carryover from that misunderstanding of Old Testament Israel. So many of these things caused confusion, and the mixing of church and state was one of those confusing things that came out of church history because they were not careful to distinguish what God has said. God did not say that the government is in charge of the church. He told the church to submit to the civil authorities in their work of civil control and so on. There have been many times, there are times today in our world this morning, while you and I sit here, there are believers in places meeting together as churches who not only do not have government permission to do that, they have government regulations telling them not to do that. And that is one of those cases where we obviously disobey the government because God has told us to gather. God has commanded the local church to gather together and worship the Lord. So at some point in time in my office, I had a picture of a group of maybe a couple dozen people in a winter scene standing out in the woods, snowing heavy. They're out there in their gloves and mittens and hats and fur coats in Russia, praying. Back when Georgy Vins was still ministering in Russia. It's a picture of Georgy Vins meeting with a group of people out in the woods. The government said you can't do that. But God says, worship me. So we're going to worship the Lord no matter what the government says. But when it comes to civil order, law, and authority, the role of the church is to obey the government, work with the government. God put them there for a reason. Now, what government does in excess beyond, that's a whole other discussion, and there's a whole lot of that goes on. Government's going way beyond, our government today is going way beyond what God has called them to do, and way beyond what our forefathers called them to do. But as I said, that's a whole other discussion. The last part of this passage might be the most unpopular. We did not purposely plan this passage to be covered at tax season, but here we are. Verse 7, pay your taxes, verses 6 and 7. Pay your taxes. Not only pay your taxes, but Paul uses a word here. Remember when I was talking about Rome conquering you people and you can keep all your gods? The word he uses for taxes here is the tribute that a conquered people have to pay to the conquering king as a not so subtle reminder of, I'm bigger and stronger than you are. I just wiped out your army. Now you're paying taxes to me on your income and your property, and get used to it because I'm going to make a heap of money off of you. Pay that tax, Paul says. Pay that tax. This is why the Jews hated the Romans. They had to pay taxes to Rome. And people said, Jesus, should we pay taxes to Rome? That ungodly government? God wants us to have our own king here. Yeah, but we don't have a king right now. We're under Roman rule. So, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And render unto God that which is God. And he's referring to the image on the coin. If you're made in God's image this morning, and you are, then you submit to God. Give yourself to God. Don't worry about paying taxes. You know, the government's always going to charge taxes. They're always going to be more than you want. Just pay them. Write a letter to your congressman. Sure, we have the means to try to influence some of that stuff, especially at the local level. But don't put on a tax revolt and think you're doing God's will, because you're not. It's not about this government. Just pay your taxes and keep on going for the gospel. Keep on living for the Lord. The Lord knows how much they're taking from you, and they're going to answer to Him for it if it's wrong. But satisfy yourself with that. Maybe you have to think on that some. When you see injustices going on and people in authority that are abusing their position, and there's so much of that goes on, just rest in the fact Judgment Day is coming. God is keeping track. And pray for mercy upon their souls. Pray for the gospel to go in and minister to those people. Pray for your government. In other passages, Paul focuses on prayer for kings and all in authority, because God is not willing that any should perish. God wants all to come to the gospel. man should thrust himself into a position of authority just so he can boss people around. That's not why God puts people in authority. He puts them in authority to serve him. To serve him. It's that simple. Everybody's going to answer for how they serve. So let us submit to the earthly authorities and cooperate with the earthly authorities. I hope you have some friends who are policemen, who are the sheriff, someone in the sheriff's department. Get to know these people. They really do recognize that they are public servants, many of them. And pray for them as well. Titus chapter 3, verse 1, remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good deed, to malign no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing every consideration for all men. God help us so to do.